time has arrived. Welcome everyone to the last formal lecture of the series, the 32nd annual lecture, the Winter Lecture Series. And there will be a panel discussion next week, and we'll remind you again before you go out for cookies. The panel will consist of David Iaquinta, moderator, David Forsyth, who you heard in the first lecture, Jerry Penner, and Bob Stoddard, all people with substantial international and other experience. So please come to the panel next week, same time. Would remind you that, silence your cell phones, thank you. I'm not going to say, I'm going to steal them and stomp on them like one of our moderators did. We're sponsored by the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Church. As you all know, you could probably recite this by now, right? After hearing it for 4 weeks. And Holly, and partially supported by the Nebraska Humanities Council. Whoops, did I get it right? Is that the new name?
Nebraska Humanities.
Nebraska Humanities, thank you. Let's see, if you'd like to receive announcements in the future years, if you put your email on the sign-in sheets, you will get announcements, or you can send an email to Dick Dienstbier at rdien@neb.rr.com with winter in the subject line. He gets a lot of emails. He's a popular guy. If there is bad weather, you can check that out on the Unitarian Church website. And I don't know how likely that is. People keep saying, isn't this beautiful weather? And I say, yes, but. Free parking in the lot across the street from our small lot if you get here at the last minute. So thank you for coming. We really had a good turnout this year. It's been a great series. And Peter Levitoff will introduce our speaker today. Peter.
Hi. I'm going to introduce a very good friend of mine of some 25 years standing, but that's not why he's speaking tonight. Dane Kennedy was born in Missouri, so he's sort of one of us, but he moved to California as a 5-year-old and lived in the Central Valley and lived in the Los Angeles area, and went to the University of California, Berkeley, where he obtained all 3 of his degrees, completing his PhD in 1981. And the thrust of his work from that time through now is primarily British imperialist history, British history with some other offshoots. In 1981, he came to University of Nebraska Lincoln as an assistant professor, his first academic job after finishing his graduate study, and he rose in rank through associate professor to full professor, and in the 1990s was the chair of the department. In 2000, he was lured away, and since 2000, he has been at George Washington University in the District of Columbia, where he holds the Elmer Lewis Kaiser Chair in History and International Affairs. His course load includes world history, British imperialism, and British history. Dr. Kennedy has been the recipient of several notable awards in his field, and I'll mention a couple: the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship in 2003-2004, the National Humanities Fellowship in 2010-2011, and in 2013 he won the Book of the Year Award from the Australian Book Review. He was vice president for 2 years of the North American Conference on British Studies from 2011 to 2013. He's written a number of books. He's been quite a prolific author. His dissertation morphed into a book on British imperialism in Kenya and Rhodesia. He wrote a book, The Magic Mountains, Hill Stations in the British Raj, that is in British Imperial India, Britain and Empire from 1880 to 1945, The Highly Civilized Man, Richard Burton, and the Victorian World. He was an editor of a volume called Reinterpreting Exploration, The West in the World. A couple more books, The Last Blank Spaces, Exploring Africa and Australia. He He's co-author of a book that is to be published this year, How Empire Shaped Us, and another piece that's coming out this year is called Decolonization, a very short introduction. Most interestingly, for the past several years, Dane has been associated with the National History Center, which is it's an independent organization with close affiliation to the American Historical Association. And he now is serving as director of that organization. I just want to read you a sentence off their website to tell you what the National History Center of the American Historical Association provides: a venue in the nation's capital for all who care about the human past to make history an essential part of public conversations about current events and the shared futures of the United States and the wider world. At the National History Center, he has led or co-led the center's International Decolonization Seminar for the past 10 years. And what kind of a greater background could one have to come into this series tonight and to talk to us? The title of his talk is Decolonization and the Problem of Nation Building. I give you Professor Dane Kennedy.
It's so neat to see so many old friends here. And my wife Marty and I, we came in on Thursday, and it's been kind of a whirlwind visiting various people. This isn't the first time we've been back, I should say, but it is a treat, and it's so wonderful to see Lincoln University, everything thriving the way that it is. And the weather isn't bad, although I realize that there are some problems with that too. Also a thrill to be speaking in a house of worship on a Sunday. I don't know what that entails exactly, but I'm gonna take it as a positive sign from someone. So, all right. Thank you, Peter, for the very generous introduction. I think Dave Forsyth in the first lecture began by mentioning that the United Nations today has almost 200 members. When it began in 1945, anyone know how many members there were? 51. 51. All right. So, over the course of some 70 years, the membership in the United Nations has nearly quadrupled. And the question then is, where did those new nation states come from? And the answer, of course, is on that slide. They came from the breakup of a number of large multi-ethnic empires. And the largest single contingent of these new nation states that joined the UN after it was founded in 1945, the largest single contingent came from the collapse of European overseas empires in the roughly 3 decades after the end of the Second World War. And this is a process commonly referred to as decolonization. So, just let me show you, there are all of those new nation states. Obviously you can't see them in detail, but you can see all those little black lines and so on. It gives you a sense of the sheer number of states that arose out of the collapse of these European overseas empires. So what I want to do this evening is to examine, obviously, how this happened and what sort of consequences arose from it. And basically, I'm going to address 3 central topics. First, I want to discuss the range of political options that seemed to be available, or certainly attracted opponents of colonial rule in the period leading up to decolonization. To put it as a question, did the process of decolonization offer any viable alternatives to the nation state? What I'm going to argue is that there certainly were alternatives that we've tended to forget about, and it's important to remind ourselves that these existed and were very important for a time. The second point I want to discuss is to consider why those options narrowed, why in fact we've forgotten about some of these other alternatives, why it is that the nation state has now become the standard template for sovereign independence. So to put it in a question form, why did the nation state become that template? And the third issue I want to address is really simply to reflect on the costs that came with the creation of these new nation states, and notably the sort of political instability and violence that often accompanied decolonization. So again, a question, there we have it. One way to begin to understand what sort of alternatives were available, or seemed to be available in this period of transition, is to look at many of the leaders of anti-colonial movements in that period from really the First World War on through past the Second World War. And in particular to look at those men who, and they were almost universally men, who were leading their countries to independence. And one of the things I want to stress about them is how extraordinarily cosmopolitan they were. They were invariably multilingual. Most had traveled abroad, often obtaining higher educations in other countries, in many cases the countries that had colonized their own. Many of them married across cultures. All of them possessed a sense of worldliness, an appreciation of other lands and peoples. And this served them well in their political struggles. And I'll just give a few examples, people that you're largely familiar with, but remind you in some sense of their background. So, start with Mohandas Gandhi, right? And here he is as a young man. He trained as a barrister in London, where he embraced English customs, English dress, English ideas. Here you see him, of course, in an English-style suit. He took elocution lessons. He tried to learn how to play the violin. This is a man who wanted to embrace English culture in many respects. He then moved to South Africa, where he spent 20 years practicing law, and the slide on the right-hand side is his law firm and his colleagues in that firm. And this is where, of course, he developed his distinctive strategy of civil disobedience. By the time he returned to India in 1915, he felt himself a virtual stranger to the country in which he had been born. So much so that he devoted the next year or so traveling around India, trying to reacquaint himself with India and Indians. His Indian National Congress colleague, the erudite Jawaharlal Nehru, was educated at two of the most elite institutions in Britain, Harrow, the public school, and in Cambridge. And this was followed by legal training at the Inns of Court in London. He too retained a strong appreciation for European culture. In fact, he sent his own daughter, Indira Gandhi, to a boarding school in Switzerland. Or consider the founding father of modern Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta. He went to England in 1929. He didn't return home for 20 years. He married an English woman. He got a doctorate in anthropology at the University of London. He visited Russia and other European countries before he came back to Kenya and became actively involved in the nationalist movement. Or his counterpart in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who earned a BA and 2 master's degrees in the United States, then spent several years residing in Britain. Much the same story can be told about others who led campaigns about British colonial rule. The same is true of prominent activists in the French colonial world. Leopold Senghor, here he is, the founding father of Senegal, went to France in 1928, graduated from the University of Paris, taught at several French universities over the next dozen years, married a French woman, that is him and his wife, in a very modern Western living room. Won election to the post-war French National Assembly, did not return to Senegal on any permanent basis until the 1950s. And if worldliness is measured merely in terms of travels to foreign lands, surely no one ranks higher in that category in the French colonial world than Ho Chi Minh, Ho Chi Minh lived abroad for 30 years. He spent time in France, in the United States, in Britain, in the Soviet Union, in China. He married a Chinese woman. He didn't finally return to Vietnam until 1941. Now, the leaders of anti-colonial movements in the Dutch, the Belgian, the Portuguese empires generally had fewer opportunities to study and travel abroad, but they too were in many respects exceptionally cosmopolitan figures. And I'll give you just one example, the Indonesian leader Sukarno, in terms of his multilingual abilities. He went to a very prominent Indonesian boarding school that was primarily intended for European children in Indonesia. He was fluent in Dutch. He was fluent in the Indonesian languages of Malay, Javanese, Sundanese, and Balinese. He also had some familiarity with English, German, French, Arabic, and Japanese. These anti-colonial cosmopolitans, this is the key point, these anti-colonial cosmopolitans understood that the global span of empires demanded a global network of resistance. It couldn't occur simply on the local level. Right? And they were drawn to doctrines that developed those sorts of networks, or promised those sorts of networks. Some, for example, were drawn to communism, which promised a transnational alliance of working people, oppressed people, against imperialism and capitalism. In the interwar years, the most prominent manifestation of that was the Moscow-based Comintern, or the Communist International, which provided inspiration for a great many of the opponents of colonial rule. And the triumph of communism in China in 1949 provided the inspiration for a large number, particularly of Asian anti-colonial figures in Vietnam, in Malaya, in Indonesia, and elsewhere. This is a wonderful Chinese communist poster extolling the virtues of this global struggle, right, against imperialism. And the Chinese were very conscious that they saw that they were seen as agents and organizers of this larger international, transnational resistance. Other critics of colonialism were drawn to pan-nationalist doctrines that promoted ethnic or religious fraternity across territorial and political boundaries. So Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism, Pan-Arabism, Pan-Islamism. All were ideas that attracted widespread interest and support. The Pan-African movement, for example, called upon Africans and their diasporic cousins in other continents to join together against Western domination. And there were a series of Pan-African congresses that were held between 1900 and 1945 that drew together an extraordinary array of incredibly talented young people of African heritage, young and not so young people of African heritage. Kenyatta attended many of these conferences, so did Nkrumah, so did many diasporic black leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore. And in a similar move, Leopold Senghor and other French, African, and Caribbean leaders joined together in what became known as the Negritude movement, which was very much along similar lines in terms of trying to identify a common bond, a pan-African bond among these peoples. And you see equivalent movements arising across the Arab world, in East Asia, and elsewhere. Still other anti-colonial activists embraced a different vision of a transnational future, one premised on greater political freedom within imperial systems themselves. Now this sounds counterintuitive. They're anti-colonial, right? They're anti-colonial, but they were not necessarily opposed to empire per se. The liberal promise of citizenship was integral to the rhetoric of the British and the French empires in particular. And both of them did put mechanisms in place that made this promise seem attainable, sometimes just barely, but attainable perhaps, to many of these highly educated, westernized colonial elites. After all, the British had granted self-government to the settler colonies of Canada and Australia and New Zealand and South Africa. And they had, at the internal level, a complete autonomy over their own affairs. And this promise seemed to extend, or was made to appear to extend, to others as well. And it beckoned a great many of these individuals. Gandhi, as a young man, for example, was an empire loyalist. Even though he was opposed to violence, he volunteered in the Boer War to provide a sort of nursing unit for the war. He remained very much tied to this sense of a greater imperial partnership for quite some time. Right? After the Second World War, the new French Constitution that was written, that created the French Union, granted some form of citizenship to all French colonial subjects. Now, this didn't mean they all had equal political rights or that they all could govern their own futures, but it seemed to some certainly as a step in that direction. Even Ho Chi Minh initially expressed high hopes for this new political order, and he stated in a letter to a friend in 1947, "There is salvation for all of us in the French Union, and you are lucky because it is an organization based upon the voluntary participation of its members." Yet none of these alternative post-colonial futures came to fruition, as we know. The failed promise of liberal imperialism was especially stark, and we can trace its collapse quite clearly to the weight of white racism. Gandhi, Ho Chi Minh, others grew increasingly disillusioned as imperial authorities failed to curb racial restrictions on colonial subjects' access to political rights and social opportunities. The failure was especially evident in those colonies with large settler populations, Algeria, Angola for the Portuguese, Kenya, southern Rhodesia, for example. But it was pervasive and pernicious across all of these empires. So when W.E.B. Du Bois famously declared that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, his diagnosis resonated with anti-colonial leaders. The pan-nationalist movements also ran into problems. The Pan-Asian movement, for example, was hijacked by Japan, which seemed to be the preeminent example of how Pan-Asian efforts could be realized and bring about independence. And a great many other Asian peoples looked to Japan as a model. But Japan itself had its own imperial ambitions, and it distorted and reshaped these claims of Pan-Asian unity in a way that were clearly intended for other purposes, and which by the Second World War most other Asian peoples came to realize was not designed to liberate them, but simply to place them in subjugation to a new imperial ruler. Pan-Africanism never managed to overcome the divergent interests and agendas of its African and American and Caribbean proponents. Even within Africa itself, efforts to establish regional federations, and there were a number of these efforts, quickly disintegrated in squabbling and division. Much the same thing happened to Pan-Arabic and Pan-Islamic ambitions as well. Nor did communism prove to be the transnational force that it seemed to promise. Not only did it face fierce resistance from the United States and its allies during the Cold War, which of course occurred in conjunction with decolonization, but it also fell victim to rivalries among communist states themselves. And none of these were more important, of course, than the Sino-Soviet split, which began about 1960, and which divided the two greatest communist powers in the country, in the world. And then, of course, you have the war between China and Vietnam in 1979, which was a simple further confirmation that communism itself was not capable of bringing those, even countries that were ostensibly or actively communist, together in some kind of transnational enterprise. So all of this suggests that these options, even though they were pursued, and pursued very actively by a variety of people, ultimately dwindled away and disappeared. And instead, the nation-state, nationalism, becomes the model, the template that comes to be embraced by almost everyone. And I should say that even for those who envision some kind of transnational future, the nation-state had always been seen as part, or not always, but in many cases had been seen as part of that future, but as a kind of subordinate part, in the same sense that one could envision, you know, a British Commonwealth in which Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on are separate countries, but they're still part of the Commonwealth, they're still part of the empire, they see themselves as part of this common purpose, right? But as these grander schemes break down, the nation-state in and of itself assumes greater importance. And there are two very distinct sets of forces that help to, help to bring this about. So I'm going to focus first of all upon sort of international precedents that help to lead to the nation-state as the outcome that we see. And then also to local circumstances, local pressures that serve this end as well. When we talk about international precedents, it's useful to keep in mind that what happens after the Second World War, this process of decolonization that occurs over roughly 3 decades, is not unprecedented. There had in fact been 2 prior waves of decolonization in world history. The first that occurred in the New World, in the Americas, between 1776 and the 1820s, and this was a process of decolonization that had liberated, obviously, what becomes the United States and various Latin American countries, as well as Haiti. The second wave was one that occurred after the First World War, with the collapse of the old land empires, the great land empires of Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. The United States plays an important role here too, I think, because its reputation as the first country to make the transition from colony to nation-state makes it a particularly attractive model to many anti-colonial movements. So our Declaration of Independence, for example, becomes the model for an extraordinary number of other nationalist leaders in successive states. So Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam draws directly upon the language of the Declaration of Independence and his own declaration against French rule. Ironically, Ian Smith and the white settlers who broke away from Britain in the unilateral Declaration of Independence in Rhodesia in 1965 do exactly the same thing and draw upon the American Declaration of Independence. And they're just 2 examples of a great number of countries that do that. At the end of the First World War, Woodrow Wilson positions the United States as the leading proponent of national self-determination. And it is an explicit part of his vision for a post-war world in which there will be no future wars. Of course, even though that declaration is advertised widely and embraced by a great number of anti-colonial nationalists, Wilson clearly didn't intend it for the non-Western world. It was a rhetoric that was simply meant to apply to Europe. So there is a period of disillusionment, but America's reputation as a country worth emulating is recovered during the Second World War, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt presses Winston Churchill to include a clause in the Atlantic Charter that affirms that all peoples have the right of self-determination. And Roosevelt, in some sense, meant it. Both world wars then in international agreements and institutions that prove to be important, if often unwitting precedents for the spread of the nation state. The League of Nations affirms that, which is established after the First World War, the League of Nations affirms that national sovereignty is now the sine qua non for admission into the international community. Now, true, it's fudged in a variety of ways, so the League of Nations still sort of embraces a kind of civilizational discourse that presumes that most non-Western peoples are not capable of governing themselves, and in fact establishes a mandate system to enforce that by transferring some of the colonial territory of the Ottomans and the Germans into the hands of the victor powers. Nevertheless, I think it's important to recognize that a moral rationale is instituted into the international discourse that makes it increasingly difficult to deny these claims to national self-determination. And when the United Nations is founded in 1945, some of its architects clearly envisioned it to be a replica of the League of Nations, clearly envisioned it to be a hierarchical body which would privilege the great powers. So, the Security Council was going to be the dominant force in the United Nations, and it was limited, of course, to these great powers. The United Nations also established a trustee council that was in many respects much like the mandate system that had been established by the League of Nations, and based on the presumption that certain peoples are simply not capable of governing themselves. Despite this, what happens, of course, is that the General Assembly becomes a far more powerful body than some of the architects of the League of Nations really could possibly have anticipated, and it becomes a powerful forum in particular for anti-colonial sentiments. And this culminates in 1960 in Resolution 1514, which denounces colonialism, quote, as a serious abuse of human rights, and declares that self-determination was legally binding. So it places it in international law in a way that is really unprecedented. The nation state also gains, so that's sort of the international dimension of the state, how the nation state becomes predominant. It also becomes predominant because of the impetus that arises out of local pressures. Calls for political rights by anti-colonial leaders were more effective, of course, if they could mobilize the masses, if they could mobilize the common folk in their communities to put pressure on imperial and colonial leaders. The idea of the nation, however it was construed, often exerted a far more visceral appeal than more abstract claims to sort of a pan-African or pan-Islamic identity, or extolling the virtues of the international proletariat, or other sort of abstract notions of affiliation. Nationalism seemed to sort of register in a more effective way with the masses than those broader, more abstract claims. But in order to engage peasants, wage laborers, market women, other common folk, those cosmopolitan elites that I talked about at the beginning of the talk, they had to address the concerns of those particular groups of peoples, and they had to address them in ways that those peoples can understand. So it became necessary for anti-colonial campaigners to grapple with land, labor, and taxation issues that were located within the colonial realm itself. Another way of sort of localizing or limiting the scope of this endeavor, this enterprise, right? And it also became necessary for them to appeal to local constituencies in their own cultural registers, drawing on their dialects, their customary practices, their religious symbols, other modes of meaning that had relevance to them. Now, I just want to show you a few slides that gives you a physical, I think, expression of how this comes to play, and how these cosmopolitan leaders begin to shift their focus in various ways. Right? There's Gandhi, the would-be cosmopolitan Englishman, and there's Gandhi as the simple peasant. There is Nehru as the English schoolboy. There's Nehru in his Nehru jacket and cap. There's Jomo Kenyatta on the left. I'm not sure who he's speaking to there. There he is on the right in the garb of an African chief. There's Kwame Nkrumah. He's a young man, and there he is in the traditional, is it kente? Kente fabric across his shoulder. And there's Ho Chi Minh, who of course was originally Nguyen Thap Bang, and who also changes his garb and appearance. Now all of this has political resonance, right? All of this is symbolic, and it's meant to speak to a particular audience, and it's meant in particular to speak to that audience within that community that increasingly comes to be defined as a nationalist community. It's a narrowing of the reach of these anti-colonial campaigns. And it reduces them at best to the territorial confines of the colony and the political confines of the state apparatus. And this is another dimension of the story, the local story that's important here. The structural constraints of colonialism itself also channeled the energies of its opponents in this more localized, what we might call national direction rather than a pan or transnational direction. So transportation and communication infrastructures, the infrastructures that these anti-colonial nationalists used, relied upon to reach their supporters and to spread their messages, roads, railways, postal systems, newspapers, and so on, operated for the most part within colonial boundaries. Cross boundaries, often the railway gauges change. It's a different newspaper, maybe in a different language. A whole variety of ways in which the colonial boundaries set the limits of political discourse. The political and military functionaries who exerted the most direct and decisive force against these anti-colonial campaigns, the headmen, the policemen, the magistrates, the soldiers, and the like, all of them are agents of colonial authorities. Insofar as the anti-colonial movement's objectives was to gain control of the institutional levers of political power, and let's face it, that's the first and primary objective. You want to control political power, right? What's the first target? The colonial state itself. Now, the payoff in gaining control of the colonial state was direct and obvious. It included control of revenue. It included jobs for supporters. It included other perks that no viable leader of an independence movement could afford to ignore. But it also placed them in a political straitjacket. It limited their leverage to pursue alternative forms of sovereignty. They became vested in bureaucratic institutions, legal structures, and territorial borders that had been put in place by their imperial opponents. And this offered the foundation for the making of nation states, but it also pushed those other alternatives off the table, right? Made them simply not viable. Finally, the colonial boundaries themselves posed another problem. However arbitrary those boundaries might appear in the context of pre-colonial cultural affiliations or state structures, any effort to redraw them ran the risk of provoking conflict with nationalists in neighboring colonies, right? Who had vested interests of their own to protect. So one of the founding principles of the Organization of African Unity, which was established by these newly independent African states in 1963, was the inviolability of the political boundaries that these countries had inherited from their imperial predecessors. Basically, the new nationalists say, okay, these are arbitrary, artificial boundaries. we're going to work with them because to do anything else is going to simply cause chaos, political chaos. So then the challenge is to create nation states create nation states given those sorts of constraints. So colonial boundaries become national boundaries by default. So this brings me to the third point I want to address, and that is the tragedy of the nation state in this context, the problems that arise out of trying to build nation states from these colonial empires. Now, the obvious problem with this default option of transferring colonial boundaries to national boundaries is that colonial populations rarely corresponded with what we might describe as national affiliations. One of the distinctive features of empires and their colonies is that they are designed to manage difference. The whole point of empires is that they incorporate a whole variety of different peoples, of different ethnicities, languages, all sorts of things, and they figure out ways to manage and to govern them, right? Whether those differences are racial or ethnic or religious or linguistic. Nations, by contrast, are designed to overcome or erase difference, right? To create what Benedict Anderson famously termed an imagined community. This isn't easily done. It takes time. It took time for European states to do this. And all too often, in this rush to transition, it involves civil war, it involves ethnic cleansing, it involves forced migration, it involves a variety of other tragedies for people on the ground. I'll give you one telling statistic. Since the end of the Second World War, intra-state conflicts, that is, conflicts within states, between ethnic, religious, or racial groups, or whatever, have been far more numerous and caused far more deaths than wars between sovereign states. By one count, there have been 127 civil wars between 1945 and 1999, compared to 25 wars between states in the same period. Moreover, those civil wars have caused over 16 million casualties, whereas the wars between states have resulted in a little over 3 million deaths. It should come as no surprise that Africa, Asia, and the Middle East in particular, places that decolonized after the Second World War, have been the sites for the majority of these conflicts. Now, some have argued that this is due to the fact that they have weak or failed states. But I think it can be more accurately attributed to the daunting challenge of transforming colonial states into nation states, transforming states with these odd mixes of peoples into states where people share some kind of common civic identity. Well, what happened in almost all of these cases is that the shape and character of these new states is often up for grabs. And as various groups have different visions of what the nation state is going to become, or what they would like it to be, right? And they struggle with one another. And in consequence, there is widespread disorder and destruction. So I just want to cite a few examples. Some of them, in fact, all of them probably are familiar with you in various ways, but they deserve repetition nonetheless. When British India was partitioned into the independent states of India and Pakistan in 1947, it produced one of the bloodiest and most traumatic post-colonial nation-building projects of the 20th century. Despite decades of parliamentary commissions, government roundtables, and constitutional blueprints by the British, there was no consensus about the sort of state that would replace the British Raj. A variety of groups, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Bengalis, Punjabis, Tamils, princes and communists, scheduled castes and tribes, countless others, jockeyed for position as the British prepared to withdraw. The Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, whose rivalry dominated the political scene, pursued irreconcilable goals, and they fueled communal violence between Hindus and Muslims that really brought British India to the brink of chaos in the last few years of its existence. And so for many, eventually partition seemed to be the only solution to the deadlock. Even after the decision was made to establish a separate state for Muslims. But keep in mind, not for Sikhs, not for various other religious or ethnic groups, not for the princes, so on and so forth. Many of the subcontinent's inhabitants had little understanding of what partition meant. And that's the other thing to keep in mind. These boundaries are drawn quite suddenly by this British official who'd never been to India. They sent him to India, he draws these boundaries, right? And he presents this as a fait accompli to both sides. Okay, here you are, here are your new countries, right? And so it's a challenge even for the leaders, but for common illiterate peasants across British India, it makes no sense whatever. Many of them had no idea where the new boundaries were or which country they belonged to. Hindu and Muslim extremists launched systematic campaigns of ethnic cleansing against members of the other community to enforce this process of transition. Perhaps as many as 1 million people were killed. Tens of thousands of women were raped, mutilated, and kidnapped. And an estimated, anywhere between, the estimates range from 12 to 20 million people were forced from their homes, made refugees, forced to seek shelter across these artificial boundaries in unfamiliar lands. This was nation building with a vengeance. And it left a lasting heritage of bitterness between India and Pakistan, punctuated by 3 wars to date, and further secessionist movements, one of which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh. A similar crisis unfolded in post-war Palestine. Here too, a plethora of British white papers failed to resolve the increasingly intractable divide between the mandated territories of Jewish settlers and Arab residents, each demanding a nation-state of their own. As political order and public security disintegrated, the British announced their withdrawal from Palestine, and they handed over responsibility for resolving the crisis to the new United Nations. It proposed, surprise, a partition plan, one that most Jews welcomed, but nearly all Arab leaders rejected. Civil war broke out in 1947. Of course, it became even more than a civil war because neighboring states got involved as well. It concluded with, in effect, the de facto partition that favored the creation of the new state of Israel. Jewish forces consolidated their gains by carrying out what can only be described as ethnic cleansing across large swaths of the country, destroying about 500 Arab villages, clearing Arab communities in major neighborhoods, and forcing the migration of upwards of 800,000 Arabs from their homes. As in South Asia, the resulting resentments and conflicts persist to the present day. Palestine, or Israel, was a rarity in one crucial respect. Its settler population came out on top. Elsewhere, settlers were the ones most likely to flee from colonies when they became nation-states. The scale and speed of that flight could be staggering, and we tend to forget this, I think, in retrospect. Algeria, within a year, nearly 1,400,000 settlers, white settlers, fled Algeria for France. Another 50,000 fled for Spain. When the Dutch lost Indonesia in 1949, 1950, they had to find room for 300,000 expatriates who had fled the newly independent country. Belgium had to absorb, little Belgium, 80,000 settlers and 10,000 officials when colonial rule in the Congo collapsed in 1960. Portugal faced an even more daunting demographic challenge. With the collapse of Angola and Mozambique, some 500,000 settlers and 200,000 troops quite suddenly returned to Portuguese shores. All told, it's estimated that somewhere between 5 and 7 million settlers, officials, and soldiers returned to Western Europe from former colonies in the decades after the Second World War. Pause here for, oh, and I did forget. Yeah. Pause for a second. The British case is, well, I'm a historian of the British Empire, so of course I'm going to give more attention to it. But the British case is kind of interesting and exceptional in one respect. And that is, even though it has the largest empire, it doesn't have this massive flood of settlers back to Britain. And you might ask, why not? Why doesn't it happen there when it happens in, for the French and the Portuguese and the Belgians and the Dutch and so on? Well, in part because the empire was so large and so diverse that uprooted colonials had a variety of other alternative places to go. And most of them, who had lived in sunny climes, didn't want to go back to Britain. If they were from other parts of Africa, they'd prefer to go to South Africa, all right? Or they might go to Australia. Many of them went to the United States. Surprisingly few of them went back to Britain, or if they went back to Britain, they often turned around and went someplace else shortly afterwards. If Britain avoided a massive influx of white colonial refugees, it was not untouched by the broader demographic upheavals that decolonization produced. Various diasporic and minority communities who had established niches within colonial economies and states became the targets of nativist violence. And these included tens of thousands of South Asians who were driven out of newly independent East African countries, and who flooded into Britain to seek refuge, which consequently, in the 1970s, spurs decision by the British government to reverse their open immigration policies, and which had been, in 1948, they passed the British Nationality Act, which basically says all colonial subjects have free entry into Britain, British subjects in that sense, and begins to impose a series of legislative measures to restrict non-white immigration into Britain. So that's a direct response to, in fact, what's going on as a result of decolonization. There are plenty of other victims in these nation-building projects, many of whom have no opportunity, in fact, to go to Britain. So Burma's Hindu, Muslim, and tribal communities find their position dramatically deteriorating as a result of the Buddhist majority consolidating their control of that country. Hundreds of thousands of Sephardic Jews were expelled from many newly independent Arab countries, many of which, of course, go to Israel. The Lebanese, who had established enclaves in West Africa, in colonial West Africa, found themselves no longer welcome and were expelled. The Yemenis Christians, a particular Christian community in some of the islands in Indonesia, who had been loyal allies of the Dutch, had served as military auxiliaries in the Dutch forces, of course, were no longer welcome in independent Indonesia, and they were forced to flee. No group, however, paid a higher price for choosing the wrong side in these wars of decolonization than the Harkis. These were Algerians who collaborated with the French military authorities. When Algeria won independence, an estimated 100,000 of them were slaughtered by the nationalists who gained control of the state. Another 100,000 flee the country to France, where they are placed in refugee camps and remain there through the 1970s because the French don't want them. Neither post-colonial regimes nor ex-imperial powers saw a place for such peoples. The challenges facing many newly independent states was to find a way to forge a shared sense of national identity among peoples who had viewed one another as antagonists in the past, or whose differences had intensified in the course of their political mobilization against colonial rule. And this challenge was especially evident in Africa, partly because of colonial boundaries, bore so little relation to pre-colonial political and ethnic sodalities, and partly because colonial authorities failed for the most part to establish very strong state institutions in Africa. Kwame Nkrumah made this plea, which is worth quoting, I think, soon after he becomes the president of independent Ghana. He says, "There should be no reference to Fantis, Ashantis, Eves, Gas, Dagomas, strangers, and so forth. But we should call ourselves Ghanaians, all brothers and sisters, members of the same community, the state of Ghana. For until we purge from our minds this tribal chauvinism and prejudice of one against the other, we shall not be able to cultivate the wider spirit of brotherhood." These were noble sentiments, but they were rarely realized. Newly independent states all too often disintegrated into civil war. In the Congo, the Belgian Congo, an army mutiny in 1960 caused a sudden collapse of the Belgian regime, but the nationalist government that came to power immediately faced secessionist movements in several parts of that huge Central African country. The crisis was made worse by the rivalry between the Cold War superpowers and the involvement of foreign mining companies, which had strong interests, especially in Katanga, the southern part of the Congo. It resulted in an intervention by the United Nations peacekeeping force. An American-supported coup against Patrice Lumumba, the first president of the Congo, which resulted in his murder, and a whole series of other complicating events. A military dictatorship eventually restored some semblance of authority in 1965, though civil conflicts continued to plague the country and lead to the deaths of millions of people for decades to come. Other notable post-colonial civil wars occurred in Nigeria, in Angola, in Sudan. 7 years after Nigeria won independence from Britain in 1960, long simmering ethnic tensions led to a secessionist movement in the southeastern part of Nigeria, an area known as Igbo land, and this resulted in the Biafran Civil War, which left 1 million people dead. Angola's Civil War. Angola's Civil War started as soon as Portuguese rule collapsed in 1975 and continued for several decades, again supported by the rivalry between the great powers in the Cold War. It pitted the two leading nationalist or liberationist movements against one another, each drawing support from a different region of the country and a different ethnic group. 500,000 Angolans died in that war, and 1 million more, or millions more, were displaced. Our third example, Sudan, has been racked repeatedly by civil wars since independence in 1955. And of course, the major fracture line is between the Muslim north and the Christian south. Over the decades, war and famine have resulted in several million deaths. Of course, here's an instance in which in 2011 we see the creation of South Sudan, a rare instance in which these sorts of civil wars results in an internationally recognized secession of a part of what had been a single country, although that doesn't seem to have done much to mitigate the violence in that country. Finally, let me briefly acknowledge events in the Middle East. We are presently both witness to and participants in an interlocking series of civil wars between Sunnis and Shiites, between Kurds and Turks, between a whole variety of denominational and ethnic groups, wars that stretch from Turkey and Iraq through Syria and Lebanon to Saudi Arabia and Yemen. More than a few commentators, of course, have traced the roots of this crisis, at least in part, to the partition of the Middle East after World War I, which created the colonial boundaries that the region's residents continue to contend with. It's also, I think, noteworthy that the most disruptive forces in the current conflicts, that is the radical Islamist groups Al-Qaeda and ISIS, Both want to establish a caliphate, which is a decidedly either pre-national or post-national, perhaps both, in any case, pan-Islamic polity that would entirely overturn the political order that decolonization brought into existence. So, let me conclude. I am done, almost done. So the rise of new nation states from the ruins of the European colonial empires is unquestionably one of the great transformations of the 20th century. Many of us were born, some of the older ones here, me, were born in a world where millions of people were still governed against their will by foreign imperial powers. Now nearly all peoples are citizens of states that ostensibly embody what is broadly described as a national will. And this is, I think, a remarkable achievement, and we don't want to diminish it. While there are some who would wish to return to a world of empires, and ironically that's a position shared by both radical Islamists and American neoconservatives, I think that most of us would agree that a world of sovereign nation states is preferable. At the same time, we need to acknowledge the terrible costs incurred by this transition from colonial subjugation to national independence, and above all in terms of the millions upon millions of peoples who lost their lives or were driven from their homelands. These costs linger with us still, and they expose the ongoing challenge of nation building in these ex-colonial territories. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kennedy. For those of you who have not been here regularly, what we do now is we take a break. In the room behind you, there are refreshments. There are baskets if you'd like to leave $1 or $2 for the cookies so we can sustain refreshments for future winter lecture series. Next week is the final program in the 6-week series, and it will be a concluding panel that analyzes, critiques, and comments on the 5 preceding sessions. So thank you very much. Come back, because we'll take a break of 10 to 15 minutes. We like to reserve close to 45 minutes for question and answer, and we'll break exactly at 9 o'clock. So thank you.